The data collection, analysis, hypothesis, and implementation cycle is an incredibly useful way to identify gaps in students' knowledge, diagnose reasons for these gaps, and devise ways of helping students work towards achieving their educational goals. Although the 5 weeks of practicum was only a very short period, and so sometimes not long enough to allow students to master complicated techniques and ways of thinking, it did allow me to recognise areas where students needed assistance and allow me to start building a foundation for the required knowledge. The types of data collected and applied during my practicum can be roughly divided into 3 categories. The first type I will discuss is related to presentation and delivery. I found this type of data to be especially important for low-level EAL students. It doesn't matter how good your material or content knowledge is, if data is not presented in a format and at a pace that can be easily understood by students, they will struggle to follow and eventually give up. Being a naturally fast speaker that is easily excited about sharing knowledge with others, this was a skill that required a lot of refining for me. Fortunately, the good thing about presentation and delivery-based data is that it's readily available almost constantly. The reasons why students are unable to follow instruction vary, but the collection and analysing of data can help to isolate exactly what it is that's confusing them and allow you to implement the appropriate steps to correct this. First, it's always important to be constantly monitoring for observation data, which may signal that students are beginning to struggle. Body language, attentiveness, and blank or confused expressions are often a dead giveaway that something is being lost in the delivery of information. Some relevant questioning will easily be able to confirm whether or not students are following the lesson. For these situations, I have found it useful to apply a sort of checklist to eliminate different variables and identify what is confusing students. This method was developed particularly using data collection and analysis from EAL students. However, for English first language students, the process could probably be refined. The first thing to consider is rate of speech. Have students been able to understand the words you have said, or does it just sound like a whir of sound to them? To check this, slow speech down, repeat what you have said, and allow wait time for students to respond. If students are now able to answer, you have identified the problem. If students are still confused, it's obviously not the pace of what is being said, so you will need to move on to the next step, which is checking the wordiness of delivery. Are your explanations unnecessarily complicated or cluttered with unnecessary words? You may think you are helping students by thoroughly explaining something, but you are actually making the task seem overcomplicated and unachievable. Be selective about the information you present and the pace at which new information is introduced. Try simplifying explanations to involve keywords and get to the point using simple sentence structures. If students are now able to answer, you've identified the problem. If not, you'll need to test for the next reason, which is rechecking for prior knowledge. Although this should have been done already, sometimes students do not have the prior knowledge base that you thought they did. Bring the lesson right back to the basic knowledge required to understand the content. Is there an area they are unclear on? If this appears to be the case, you may need to deviate from your lesson plan to ensure that everybody has this prior knowledge clear in their heads before attempting to move on. However, if students do have this prior knowledge in place, and all of the previous points have been satisfied, the problem is probably due to your presentation of the material. Could the way you are presenting the material be unclear or confusing? Is there a different way you can think of to explain it? Drawing analogies from different areas of knowledge that you know students have mastered is often a good way to do this. Being aware of students' strengths and weaknesses by being familiar with their skills-based data will allow you to use things that they are good at and concepts that they understand in order to explain areas that confuse them. The next type of data I will discuss is skills and abilities-based data. This includes any data that indicates students' language skills and level. It looks at their strengths and weaknesses, thinking and problem-solving processes, and gaps in skills and knowledge. I found this the most useful way to keep track of relevant information was to develop a database which listed individual students' learning progress based on assessment data. At first I included only students' weaknesses and gaps in knowledge, but as I got further into the data cycle process, I realized that it was also useful to list their strengths as well, as this could be just as useful when trying to explain difficult or confusing concepts. Giving students the opportunity to practice and demonstrate their acquired and emerging skills is important for keeping your database up to date and to ensure that relevant issues to students are being addressed and understood. I created the opportunity for data collection on students developing language skills to take place every Monday morning by implementing a personal narrative writing session. Each week, an aspect of students' language that needed to be mastered according to information recorded on the database was introduced as a focus for the week's writing session and referred to in lessons throughout the week. Being aware of the way your students learn will also allow you to present information in a way they can easily acquire it. For example, when teaching about the difference in the long and short sounds of the letter E, an exercise where I was pronouncing words and asking students to identify which E sound they could hear by calling out either long or short was experiencing only moderate success. I began to analyse why, when it occurred to me that the connection between the sound of the letters and the terms long and short was really quite arbitrary. So I decided to change students' responses to a more evident association with the sound they could hear, by having them call out the sound itself, either e or e. After this technique was introduced, student accuracy improved dramatically, and I have been able to apply this information whenever devising future listening activities. Being aware of the type of thinking required in questions that students are struggling with will also indicate skills which they have not yet mastered. An example of this is when I was constructing comprehension questions based on a novel the class was reading. Upon assessing students' answers, I realized that the questions that all students were struggling with required inferential thinking. In subsequent worksheets, I posed questions that were only literal in nature. However, students still struggled with any questions that used different wording to the sentence in the novel. I realized that this was obviously a skill that students had not yet mastered, and began to devise ways that I could begin to introduce this level of thinking to them. As students were unable to consider information that was not presented literally to them, I decided to introduce an activity that required them to use their imaginations. I had students try to imagine various aspects and details of the story that were not mentioned in the book. Once we began, I knew I had identified a gap in abilities because students were unable to give me any details that weren't written explicitly in front of them. I simplified questions and emphasized that there was no right or wrong answers, just different ideas. Eventually, one or two hazarded a guess. Great, I told them. Then I asked other students if they had agreed or if they had a different idea. Once students realized that what they imagined was completely up to them and didn't need to agree with the rest of the class, they began to open up and enjoyed imagining different aspects of the story and comparing their ideas to everybody else's. As another scaffold towards inferential thinking, I began to introduce exercises that required students to predict what was going to happen on the novel, based on different information that was available, with the idea being that they would start to use some information that they had to build new information. This was slightly harder for them because their predictions could in fact be right or wrong, and that worried them at first. The key to this activity was getting students to realize that it didn't matter if they were right or wrong. It was fun to guess, and often a lot more fun if your guesses were wrong, because the book would give you a surprise, which made it more exciting. Although I did not spend enough time with students to see them through to full inferential thinking, the skills that these two activities allowed them to master formed some of the basic skills required. Being able to consider existing information and create further information based on that was something that these students were unable to do beforehand, and it was an important step for these students to begin to master the basics of inferential thinking. Finally, I'll discuss the use and collection of methods and techniques-based data. Teaching methods and techniques play a substantial role in student engagement. If material is taught in a way that is interesting and enjoyable to students, they become engaged with and enthusiastic about their learning. Classes are more fun, and minds are more open and willing. The following are a couple of the methods I managed to find some success with after using the data cycle to refine my technique. The use of visual aids via the use and organisation of the whiteboard and data projector was a method that was very useful for EAL students. Rather than trying to introduce more complicated language to explain and define terms they were already struggling with, if it were possible to project a picture, refer to a diagram, or even just point to information displayed on the whiteboard, students found lessons much easier to follow and concepts easier to comprehend. Noticing the effectiveness of visual aids also led to the discovery of another effective method: students' love of props. Being able to simply show students a picture of something I was trying to explain worked so well, I thought I would take this idea a step further and bring items in for them to see whenever possible. This was most effective when introducing vocabulary items. Being able to touch and handle the items gave students a real reference for vocab, and I found that items I managed to bring in for them to see and touch were far more easily retained than other items from the word list. The use of props also had benefits related to engagement levels. Students were interested in anything that didn't normally belong in a classroom. It made lessons more exciting and learning more fun. For activities where I used props, students were far more engaged and excited about their learning. And finally, activities which require students to recognise mistakes and correct their own work are essential for building good language skills. However, the first time students attempted this, they were unable to do it. Upon reflecting upon possible reasons for this, I realised that students had no experience in identifying mistakes in writing before, and mistakes that they had made themselves would be the hardest to recognise of all, because if they realised they were mistakes, they wouldn't have written them in the first place. So with this in mind, I decided to get them to correct a sample of some writing that I had prepared, which contained some common mistakes that were often made by students and were confined to 3 key areas, which they were told to focus on. This activity was surprisingly successful compared to the students' first attempt with their own work. After allowing students to practice on deliberate mistakes made by the teacher, I decided to let them try with some actual mistakes made by EAL learners by getting them to correct their peers' work at the end of activities. These were somewhat harder to recognise, as not all mistakes fit into three nice, neat categories. But as students got used to the sorts of things that they should look for, they began to find it easier. The building of these skills provided students with the basic framework required to eventually become proficient at revising and correcting their own work. The use of data to inform teaching is an integral part of being a professional teacher and also of allowing students to reach their full potential. Lessons can be made more effective, more relevant, and more enjoyable. This is an incredibly important and valuable technique that I would encourage every teacher to become familiar with and employ in their day-to-day teaching experiences.